Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. This is one of those rare episodes where we think every human who is able to listen could benefit from it. Whether you're a few days, a few weeks, or even a few decades into the fitness game, you're someone who's alive in 2021, and every last one of us could and should reconsider how we learn and how we consume digital content online. And today, you'll be hearing Eric Helms, Brad Loomis, and Alberto Nunez discuss just that. The guys will tell you about the filters, systems, and processes they've used to cut through the noise of the internet and become better thinkers, athletes, and coaches. You'll hear about the mistakes they used to make themselves, mistakes that many of our athletes make when it comes to media consumption, and most importantly, how to decide what is worth listening to, what is worth implementing, and what is just noise or entertainment to be enjoyed but mostly ignored. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this episode, head on over to 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 174. Please enjoy this episode titled Developing Your Content Filter with Brad Loomis, Alberto Nunez, and Eric Helms.
What's going on, 3DMJers? I'm here with coaches Brad Loomis and Alberto Nunez today, and we're going to be talking about probably one of the most important topics that you could imagine is understanding what you're actually listening to and applying it in a way that is appropriate for you. And I am almost regretful that it's been 175 some odd episodes before we've talked about how to actually understand what we're talking about. So we've wasted, 3 years. 4, 5? It's 2021, guys. I don't even know. But no, in all seriousness, we've noticed a few things in the last couple Q&As we've had and some interactions is that I wouldn't say more often than not, but I'll say a number of times, some people will hear our advice as it applies to competitive bodybuilders. I think maybe it applies to them when they're not, or hear our advice in specific circumstances and not know if it applies to them. And I don't know about you guys, but my Instagram is kind of evidence to this almost on a daily basis, that we need to do a better job as content creators and as leaders, making sure that we're clear about the context around the information we give so that people don't think it applies to them when it doesn't, or something that doesn't apply to them when it does. So yeah, I don't know what thoughts you guys have been having about this lately.
Yeah, on behalf of all of us, I guess, once again, I'm sorry, guys, because, it's been a while. We've been running with this podcast, and it's just, the funny part is it's kind of, it's like, having a rock in your shoe. You should take it out, but like, I'm just going to keep stepping. I'm gonna keep stepping, because this thing has just been reoccurring forever where, we will get those messages from people where it's like, I heard this, and that, so I started doing this, and that, and it's like, no, you completely... And it's easy to sometimes just get frustrated, but, like on our end, I think we just have to be a little bit more clear about who this is for. And then also, and we'll go over this today, how to, I guess, like, take these podcasts, take the Instagram post as these articles as just a way to beef up your toolbox and your know-how, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, everything's going to be used today necessarily.
Yeah, and just I think talking about a subject or putting it into context, right? What are we talking about as far as an example? Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you guys, but it seems like the biggest misconception I think that most people have is what level they are in their bodybuilding and lifting career. So many times I'll have people say, "Oh yeah, I've been hard at it now for 5 years, and so therefore I'm an intermediate." And, I think a lot of times, 5 years seems like a long time, but really in the weightlifting and bodybuilding world, even if you've been doing, checking all your boxes just perfectly, 5 years is not that long. It's kind of like I always equate it somewhat to a 5-year-old human. Imagine your 5-year-old self and then think about like Jeff in the gym and compare his years as a human to your years as a human. And then it kind of puts a little bit more, like I said, context to what is truly intermediate, what's advanced, what's novice, et cetera. But I don't know about you guys, but that's the biggest one that I see is people start trying to apply principles and advice that are meant for like true intermediates, maybe advanced, that have been at it for sometimes 20 years, checking all the boxes that we talk about. And because they've been at it for 2 or 3 years, they think that it applies to them. And so, I don't know, what do you guys see? Do you see other areas where that seems to be, or what are your guys' biggest misconceptions, I guess, that you see a lot?
I think that's a really good one. And I think there's even distinctions to be added to just with that same point. Like, I think someone who has ticked all their boxes and has been training really hard for 5 years, they probably will have a intermediate or advanced level of muscle mass, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have an advanced or even intermediate level in terms of their relationship with food or the habits they have down. Or hell, they may have been in the gym 15 years, but they haven't yet got on stage and they're considering it. And that first time to the stage, it's not about how big your pecs are. It's about, do you have the mental and emotional and social capacities to handle the stresses that are contest prep? So I totally agree with you, Brad. I think sometimes we talk about things like, adapting your lifestyle around contest prep that we've come up with after coaching hundreds of athletes and doing, double-digit numbers of shows ourselves. And I think it's awesome. Don't get me wrong, if you're a first or second time competitor, to hear that stuff. But sometimes you don't yet have the prerequisite skill set, or it sets false expectations for what you can accomplish or what your experience might be like. When in reality, you just need to hear like, yeah, you're going to be white knuckling it. It's going to be a mess. You're going to do your best. It's going to explode, but it'll get better. Don't worry. And then you can work on it next time. So I think, yeah, that, not that I want this to be all about levels of lifters, because there's so many ways we could talk about this, but that's just kind of a little bit of an insight into how big a Pandora's box we're opening here, that there are levels of context for all of this. And, Berto and I front-loaded the blame on ourselves here. And I think, of course, as content creators, we do have to be, as consistent as we can with providing context and specifics and adapting the information. But I think there is inevitably a certain leg of the race where we can't carry that baton. And we need you to meet us, maybe not even halfway, but some portion of the way where you think about, all right, well, how does this apply to me? Because ultimately, even when we do Q&A episodes, it's not like you're sitting here with us explaining the context and we're answering it. We're getting a little tiny snapshot, but most of the time we're not doing Q&A sessions, and you're a fly on the wall listening to the discussions we have and hopefully trying to glean something from it that can help you. So I think we can spend a good amount of time in this podcast talking about maybe how do we, when we're consuming information and learning as coaches, how do we take what's good and leave the rest and figure out the ways that things can apply to us. So anyway, a little bit of a meta thing, but to answer your question, Brad, absolutely. I think levels of lifter is a huge one. I think another one that is not necessarily about experience directly is just the quote unquote like classification. Like, are you a power lifter? Are you training for strength? Are you a bodybuilder? Are you training for bodybuilding? Or are you a competitive bodybuilder or a competitive powerlifter? I think those things will lead to very different advice. And I think sometimes people think that, okay, I'm a quote unquote recreational bodybuilder. I have no intentions of competing, but I want to mold my physique. Therefore, the people I should really be listening to are the ones who do this like professionally or as an amateur or whatever, but competitively. And they've got all the keys to what I need. And I think that isn't as true as often as people think it is.
Man, I guess sometimes I have to put on my consumer role hat on to, understand what it's like to be on that side. And like when I go back to like, okay, when were you like really like in the heat of it all? When, you were searching here, searching there, back in the day, Eric, we had the forums, and I remember I was a member on like 8 different forums, because I couldn't get enough, right? It didn't move fast enough, if anything, back then was kind of the problem, which in hindsight maybe wasn't a bad thing because, you get some information, you're able to sit on it long enough and really just split it open some, dissect and maybe you're not necessarily applying it to yourself, but I think it was just good to know. And I guess where I go with this, because like you said, putting some of the responsibility back on the consumer, and when I really started to take off as a learner as a student was when I was a little bit more interested on just like yeah, attain a little bit more breadth when it comes to what I knew, even if it wasn't necessarily. It's like, hey, I'm a bodybuilder. I don't need to know what you know uh, humeral adduction is necessarily. I just do chest, bro. And you can do incline, you can do flat, or you can do decline. That's all I need to know. But once I started to just take a step back, really understand like the hard principles. Um, I think then whenever I started to earn some new tools, I would put them in the right place, and it was a lot less confusing. It was a lot more organized. And realistically, I think it took me 10 years to get to the point where I think 2010, 2011, where I was finally, um, not necessarily consumed with knowing everything now, or running with an idea right away, but more so just I guess using a lot of this because a lot of this evidence based like side of fitness, especially, I think it's a good chunk of our people. It's almost like a separate hobby. It's like you have your lifting, and then you have this other thing you do, and I've always found. Um, that side of the coin to be a just life training in general. It was like,
Mm.
it's like whenever I am presented with like different situations, like whatever it might be, like I don't know, searching for a new car or something. It's like I put on what I've learned through bodybuilding and I try to apply it to that world in which I am currently very ignorant in. So yeah, it goes back to getting your GEs, not rushing it, and then from there, you just get so much better at putting everything in compartments, and yeah, you become a better absorber of the knowledge, but also a better critical thinker, right?
Hmm.
Like, and one example of this, Eric, was remember the blood flow restriction when that first came out? I was so like, no freaking way,
Hmm.
like right. This is the one thing I will not do. Like, what are Jeremy and Lane doing? Like, this is too much, man. And then funny, like fast forward, you get hurt a few times and you're like, oh, okay, this thing really came in handy. And I was clowning it, just a few years back. And now it's a very handy tool. And I tried presenting it to people and I got that same sort of like, I guess, backlash. Right. So yeah, getting my GEs I think was important, and I think that's where hey, good plug-in for the muscle and strength pyramids because literally those are like my first 8 to 10 years. Like I could have saved so much time, man, had I just like had there been something like that at the time,
Mm. You're not wrong. I feel the same way when I look back on where I was. But Brad, I'll let you go first before I share some forum stories.
Well, I Alberto really jostled a couple thoughts in my head when it comes to myself consuming content, and I'll probably slow down the conversation here a little bit, but I often find that things sometimes move too fast for me, and specifically kind of what I'm talking about is, I'm a big consumer of mass, obviously, so I don't want to push all of our products all at once, but I guess I'm doing that. But mass sometimes moves too fast for me. It comes out, quarterly, Eric, is that correct?
Monthly.
Monthly? See,
So,
it needs to come out
but
quarterly.
you wish it came out quarterly.
He gets to it quarterly, yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of times I don't get to go all the way through all of the mass stuff because, and granted,
Just as a quick aside, by the way, if it was quarterly, it would be QAS, which wouldn't make any sense because it's monthly applications and strength sport. So just a quick way to remember that for the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate.
Oh, it'd be
that.
cool if we had
QS.
Yas. Yes.
Oh, yearly
Yeah, 'cause
applications and stuff.
You're waiting a year and you're like, yes.
I've been waiting a year for this. Yes, Queen.
But all kidding aside, and Brad trying to get the red face put away now. Like I said, a lot of times I don't even get all the way through it, because with me, the way that I consume my content, first of all, on the actual content itself, I have to kind of like stop, pause, rewind, go back to what it was that I just listened to, especially with maps. Because I mean, you and Dr. Zerdos and the other Eric, and Greg and those guys, when you guys talk, sometimes I have to like dummy it down for myself, and I'll have to like, okay, so this is the terms that they're using, but really, it's kind of like microcycle week, kind of like the same thing, block, month, etc. And so I have to go back and I have to listen again. And sometimes that's frustrating and that's kind of hard. And so, it takes a while for me to get what the true meaning of what's going on there, and more so how I can apply it to me and my athletes and my clients and the people that I'm helping, etc. But then also, I sometimes feel bad if I don't try it out myself. If I don't take what it is that I'm listening to and then apply it to myself, do it myself, kind of somehow take what it is that I'm doing. I don't know it well enough, And so sometimes I think that people, they're trying to absorb everything. They're trying to absorb this podcast and that podcast and that content creator and that content creator, when really, in my opinion, in today's day and age, it's all coming out way too fast, and it's so easy to get just overwhelmed and then want to try to do everything. Like the first time I took my kid into Toys R Us, he stood there like a zombie for like at least 2 minutes, which for a 5-year-old is an eternity, to just stand there overwhelmed, you know what I mean, before he could actually dive in. And so that's just when Bert was talking about how back in the day when it wasn't moving fast enough, that jostled that little memory in my head, back then you're right. It didn't move fast enough, but now it's like, I wish it would kind of slow down a little bit so that I had time to absorb everything that I'm listening to, and then also to try it out, to try it out, give it a good shake. I mean, I'm not talking about doing it for a week or two or a month. I'm talking about a good shake, and then find out if it even is worth my time and my passing it on to, the specific people that might apply to. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there.
There's a couple of things that both of you guys said which I think are really, really good. Brad, specifically, the trying to consume it all and understand it all at the same time. It's kind of like one of those things where you can do a lot of things at the same time really shitty, or one thing really well. And I think some of the urgency that we have is because of, the marketing behind things. It makes it all sound equally good at the same time. Like, you have to get people with the clickbaity-esque titles, and then all of a sudden your perception is like, all this stuff's coming out. All of it's important. I got to know it all. And it really leads to poor uptake of information and less critical thinking around it because of that. Because you just can't absorb that much information. So I think that is absolutely true. And letting that siren go by, I think some of the ways you need to look at it they should change over time. So I remember, Berta, you talked about the forums, and I specifically remember bugging the mods back in the day, who were an intelligent group of people, the moderators on the forums, like, well, just tell me what to eat after my workout. And this was like pre-Eric interested in science for science's sake, but just pure athlete trying to get the best information. And I was very frustrated by their wishy-washy answers. And this is very similar to what you hear today, people who just get frustrated with quote-unquote science. When it's like, oh, you're always changing your mind. There's always these caveats. You can't give me a clear answer. And I think the underlying attitude is actually the issue. It is that you're looking to science for answers to your problem that are right. it's almost the kind of the same way that we look to gurus. Like, look, Jack guy, tell me what to do and I'll do it, you know? And that's a very athlete-centric way of doing it and a way of thinking, which is totally understandable. But I think as soon as you sign up to be part of the quote-unquote evidence-based community, I think one of the things you have to internalize as early as possible is that anyone who gives you super confident, specific, hardcore, rigid black and white answers is wrong somewhere, at the very least. The more hyperbolic about it, the more best and amazing and works for everyone it sounds, the less likely that is to be true. And that is what science is. It's slowly chipping away at the untruths until we get something closer to what is probably better than what you were doing before. But ultimately, there was a time when we didn't understand quantum mechanics. There was a time when we thought the four humors explained things and that light traveled through miasma and that, the Earth didn't orbit the sun. It was the other way around. So science has to be wrong to thus chip away an untruth to get righter and righter. So as soon as you sign up for this, all of a sudden you have to shift your perspective from looking for, instead of just shifting away from IFBB pro person or super S&C guru person to science as your guru, but now you have to go, all right, I need to change the way I even look at information. No one can give me the specific exact truths anymore. And I think back to, being quelly on the boards in 2005 and being like, just tell me the exact number of carbs and fat to eat post-workout, and whether it should be 30 minutes afterwards or whether I need to bring a shake to the gym, and quit messing with me, silly, smart moderator person. And I think I was my own barrier because I expected there to be an answer because I grew up on magazines that always gave you specific answers. They told you in how many weeks you'd grow X number of inches by doing this sets and reps of these exercises, just like insert name of bodybuilder, So I think that's the first step, is just acknowledging that if you're in the hunt, you're in the hunt for a different type of truth. It's not the absolute end all be all. You're looking for things that might get you closer. So I think that's a really huge first step. And it's a hard one. And it's one that you kind of have to keep smacking yourself over the head with over and over, because you're going to fall back into that pattern of looking for the black and white answers. And anytime you do, you're going to be a little bit wrong at best case. So I think that's a tough one.
Yeah. But there is, I guess, not truth necessarily, but there are certain things that's like we've established as like again, going back to the pyramids, it's like, if you know all this,
principles,
right?
Yeah.
It's like, as straightforward as my team. It's like, like if you're going to take up boxing, it's like, hey, you know what? We don't do it with our feet like this. Like we have one in front of the other. Like it starts, it's all boring stuff that no one wants to hear, they just want to go straight to the guy that looks the part, the guy that's been getting some results, or the coach who, has these athletes. But I think it's your own responsibility to like just know the fundamentals, like the back of your hand, and like practice, and like, because again, like the order of that pyramid still to this day, 21 years into training, man, it's been over a decade, I guess, competing professionally now. It still applies. And like for one, it's like the adherence thing, like that still matters to me right now, even though a lot of this is just like pretty automated and second nature. Like I have to check where I am right now in regards to that. And here's, because someone out there's going to say like, well, Bert, maybe you should work on that. Like, that mental resiliency. If you can't adhere to something, man, it's been 21 years. But for example, it's like, what can I structurally like handle, like with this situation or that situation, right? It's like, how much, I don't know, how much hinging can I do before my SI joint? Like that's part of my adherence, and I have to always go back to that because it takes many forms. But again, it's we're limited by what it is that we can actually do at the end of the day. So yeah, I mean, I skipped him. I didn't count calories until I was like year 8 or 9 because I didn't think that applied to me because I'm a bodybuilder.
Yeah.
And then I count calories and I'm like, holy crap, I've never seen so many changes, predictable changes in my physique in such a short period of time. So yeah, actually on my birthday post, I posted something about this, like don't cut corners on yourself, or anything really in life. Cause, at some point, if you're aware enough to know, you're gonna have to go back and redo that shit. And like for me, bodybuilding has been a lot of it has been just that. It's like going back and like, all right, let's like kind of relearn how to do this thing because you thought you were too good for that when you first started.
Yeah.
So yeah, not fun, not the fun answer, but yeah, it's just, it matters that much.
Going back to what you were saying about blood flow restriction training, I think to some degree, you mentioned how like you'd skipped some steps and you'd wish you'd had the pyramids early, but I think you do have a pretty good BS sensor, Berto, and I think you always have. When I met you, you had super training at a very young age, and yeah, there was things that training age, I should say, and there were things that you found like, oh man, I should have been counting calories, or I wanted to rush this and that, but I think the reason why you had skepticism for BFR is because it is actually one of those few accurate, scientifically valid things that sounds like BS. It's like,
yeah,
lift light weights and just wrap your arms with this thing and get the same growth you would if you train hard. Like it's it looks kooky, it looks like a gimmick, and I think to some degree, I think you should be credited for that. And the way I want to link this to our conversation is that I think most people who, if they do have a good BS sensor, would cock their eyebrow initially at BFR. And, I did too. And I think, getting back to kind of what prompted this whole podcast is that we've had people who follow us who pretty much are open to everything we have to say, which I tell you what, it's a huge honor to hear that. It's also a little scary sometimes.
Yes.
And I think I've been there too, because before I had better BS sensor / critical thinking skills, I would focus all of my assessment on not on the information, but of the person. And if I thought the person was someone I could trust, and if I thought the person was intelligent, then I go, okay, sweet. I'm going to put you in team good guys and gals box. And then all the things that you suggest, I'm good with it. And I think that's a great first step. But I think what you really want to do is start assessing people for their trustworthiness. That's always great. But also consider that they're always going to be fallible and that there are people just like you. And try to assess also, well, what's their expertise? What's their knowledge? What are their biases? And how do they go through the process of thinking through things? Like if I trust them to have better information and I want to learn from them, not only do they just know a lot of things, but they're apparently good at learning things and figuring things out. And that is probably where there's more gold to be obtained. And also it means that they can say things and be wrong. And you're less likely to just go, all right, carte blanche for everything they say I'm going to do or apply it to myself or it's really important. It allows you the permission to start evaluating those things. And I think that's another step, if it's an important one, is, yeah, it's great to start kind of, looking at valid and invalid sources of information, but, a broken clock is right twice a day and smart people are wrong sometimes. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast. So being able to move towards assessing information instead of just kind of that almost tribal mentality of like, oh, there's team good guys, there's team bad guys. I'm going to listen to these people. I'm not going to listen to these people. It's okay if you start there. And that, plays into some in-group, out-group social dynamics and all that. And it's a very natural place to go. We're still just apes. But I think it is important to start critically evaluating even things on your in-group leaders, and go, right, is everything they say always accurate? Okay, no, of course not. So let me think about some of these things instead of just, kind of chasing anything they put out as the next carrot in my training. Because even if you have a list of people, even then it still moves fast. Like Brad was saying, as we've been pimping all of our products, if you get mass, there's something that comes out every month. If you read the pyramids, there's that. And if, we promote other folks, we have a podcast, there's Iron Culture, there's all kinds of shit that's coming out all the time. And I would say, even if you're just consuming like the greater cinematic universe of 3DMJ's content, it's still kind of a fire hose,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just something to consider that you guys had me think about based on what you said.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back 5 years, like there's some of our content from 5 years ago. We're like, oh, that's lightweight embarrassing, right? And And so again, like 5 years from now, same thing. I'm pretty sure if we're doing our job, 5 years from now, we'll be like, ooh, okay, well, that didn't really pan out the way we suspected it might. And I think, like you said, it's perfectly natural initially to just kind of find these people who are kind of home base, who, they kind of guide you. You watch them do their thing, interact with information that is out there. And to me, it's always impressed me when, certain folks have been like, you know what, I changed my mind on this. I was totally, like those people always made me feel like, oh, okay, so, shoot, I should really pay attention to them. Because I know for me, every time I've been wrong and I've had to change my mind on something, it's come with something with a great benefit. And that like, okay, I think this is more updated. This is a little bit closer to the center of the target that we're trying to figure out here. There's that. And then also the folks that kind of stay in their wheelhouse, like you know what, I don't know, because I don't want to step on someone else's toes. And to me, that's something that initially, when I was trying to look for the right people to follow, I'd pick up people like that. But as time goes on, and you see, hey, your heroes, like they can be wounded, like they're not perfect, right? I guess it just makes you a little bit more self-sufficient from there, and you start to form your own way of thinking. You become I guess, an honorable skeptic in some ways, and to me, that's why it's almost different from my training. Like this is a puzzle piece that we get to play around with, like going on that podcast a while back. It was Menno, Brian, the whole gang basically. And we're talking about refeeds or no refeeds. And like to me, like the fun part was just like throwing ideas in the hat. And like we're gonna be probably all in a slightly different place like 5 years from now. And to me, that's that's the fun. It's like building up your physique. It's not done yet. It's like let's keep, or I guess another way of putting it, it's like you don't use every freaking machine in your gym. Depending on what you need right now, like that is what you pull from, and that is what you try to master and what you really try to focus on. So these days, I try to pick one or two things that I'm really, really interested in, because the information it just goes by so fast. And like there's one main focus. I'm like, this is going to be my flavor of the week for a while. And then this will be kind of like the side dish. And whenever I'm tired and just stuck here, I'll go to that one. But then make it back to the primary one. But yeah, learning to be a great student has not only benefited my bodybuilding personally, it's benefited my athletes, but it's taught me so many lessons that I've been able to take into. I'm trying to find a used car here. And like and like being in, like I'm not a car dude, so like being in that world, it's like I intuitively just want to ask that question. It's like no, so like what is the best car that I can buy for under $10,000? And like I get similar answers, and it's frustrating at first, but I'm like, okay, no, Bert, it's just like dedicate 20 hours to this freaking answer, because it's a big purchase, and at the end, you'll probably have fun figuring that stuff out, and you learn a lot as well.
Hi again. Just wanted to remind you guys that we have a pretty giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The Vault is a place we can organize our best information, pair it with some of our favorite resources, and share it with all of you in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole bunch more. A lot of it is free, some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's at 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.
Yeah, the hard part about being wrong, or admitting when you haven't necessarily, you finally realize that there's better ways to do things. You know what I mean? Is that, at least in my experience, it's kind of like, well, gosh, what we've been doing has worked so well. I've gotten such and such bodybuilders, their pro card, and I've gotten such and such competitors their elite total, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, sometimes it's really hard to peel yourself away from what you know works. And that is a lot of times what me is the big skeptic. I mean, it's like I'm skeptical to just start, like a big epiphany I had was just last year. I need to start having my bodybuilders put weight on, because I was always and there was some evidence to support it that basically said, well, we need to maintain. We don't want to get too big and too heavy and too much of a surplus too fast, because there's such and such a study showed that it's just, the muscular changes are not really, that good, or they're not as optimal as we think they are. And then all of a sudden we have all this evidence that kind of shows that, well, you know what, you do need to put on weight. And it's kind of like, wow, I don't know if it's that I've been wrong. I'm almost afraid to try X strategy or to apply this new evidence that's happening, and that's, I think that's one of the things that kind of makes some of us kind of the opposite. We're good consumers of content, but we're not willing to keep up with the times, kind of, so to speak, is because what we've been doing is working, And I always remember Zerdos in one of the things that I was listening to is it's like, well, it works good now, but it's only because we're comparing it to what we do know, and we still haven't been able to compare it to what we don't know, and that was a big eye-opening experience when it was like, oh yeah, okay. we got to find out other stuff that's out there before we can find out if it works better, Yeah,
there's a classic Zerdos quote when he's talking about, I think it's a dissertation study where he's comparing two different formats of daily undulating periodization. The order being...
That's exactly the one that I'm talking about, yes.
Yeah, hypertrophy power strength, or hypertrophy strength power, and hypertrophy power strength did better. And he was like, for all we know, this is the second worst one, and we compared it to the worst.
Exactly, yeah.
And Zerdos actually does a really good job of talking about how to utilize scientific information, and kind of explaining that it always needs to be conceptual instead of looking at it in a very literal sense and integrated, because what we do in the gym is always very different than what we see in a specific study, and it doesn't just last 8 weeks, and it has to be applied as coaches to hundreds of people in different ways in a different context. So if we can't understand it from in a conceptual manner, and we can't take this amorphous concept and make it into a specific tool for a given situation, then it's really useless to us. And going to your example of the context around weight gain, like we do know that putting on a lot of weight quickly is probably going to result in excess body fat, and we do know that you can put on muscle while you're at maintenance, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that there's never a time to be in a large calorie surplus relatively to what we were just discussing. Especially with earlier stage lifters, or, when everything else seems to not be working. It's certainly something to try. And I think the willingness to be experimental and step outside of your comfort zone is how things get done and things move forward, for sure. So, I totally agree with that, Brad. I think those are good points. And it kind of goes back to, how do we view scientific information that we get? Because it's very easy to view it as static. Things that come out, that's the way it is. And I think the way we talk about science, particularly within the evidence-based community, lends itself towards focusing on things that aren't as important as the principles, to get back to what you said, Berto. We're definitely going to do like a third edition of the muscle and strength pyramid sometime in the next couple of years, but there's not going to be big changes, Thermodynamics isn't going to change. The role of the macronutrients isn't going to change. Progressive overload and the relationship of volume and intensity and frequency aren't going to have big changes. Adherence is always going to be the most important thing.
Supplements won't be at the bottom
absolutely
anytime
not.
soon.
unless we're no longer talking about natural bodybuilding, and then it might go down 1 or 2 levels. But yeah, unless we mean special sports supplements, and the other side of the fence. But 100%. So I think, an interesting thing is, like, if you follow like the podcast circuit in the evidence-based community, you see people arguing about progressing volume. You see people, and by people I mean like me and other people most of the time, people arguing about the role of refeeds and diet breaks, like Berto was alluding to with his one with Jackson Pios and Brian. You see people arguing about different peaking strategies. And these are things that are worth thinking about and worth talking about. Don't get me wrong. However, if you were to match your level of focus, time and effort, and critical reasoning that you apply to the various topics to what was on your YouTube feed, you would be emphasizing the 5% with 90% of your efforts rather than what really matters. So I think to kind of bring this full circle back to what you were saying, Berto, is that understanding those things that probably aren't going to change is the by far the most important thing that's going to make almost all of the difference for you. And I think while the sexy thing, the exciting thing, the thing that will have you listening to the vast majority of a podcast or watching the majority of a video is controversy, and it's the things that people are arguing about. It's the things that people are not arguing about that should actually get most of your time, attention, and efforts. Mm-hmm. Because what we're not arguing about is the role of progressive overload. What we're not arguing about is energy balance. What we're not arguing about is the importance of protein and having balanced macronutrients and getting your vitamins and minerals and training with a sufficient volume and making sure that you have a plan. And those things have been, not the focus for at least in kind of the headline catching topics, whether they're podcasts, whether they're new articles, et cetera. But they're absolutely the things that, we wrote our books about. And I think that's a really, really good reminder for people is that the evidence-based community is not, of content producers, they're not producing content that necessarily reflects the importance. They are talking about things in the frame of science and from a perspective of trying to get close to the truth and using a rational, skeptical, empirical approach. But it's still like trying to get views on YouTube and trying to get likes and clicks and you to buy shit and hire coaches. So it means that what's currently hot is what's going to be on people's feeds. And, there's I can't tell you many times where I've felt bad about the fact that I don't keep up with the trends in the evidence-based community or otherwise. Like I'll get questions all the time like, hey, what do you think about XYZ training or XYZ diet plan? And most of the time I go, I haven't heard of it. And that's never bit me in the ass. And it's not that I'm completely ignorant to it all. I just know that if it hangs around long enough and enough people do it, that's when I'll start paying attention. But this shit comes and goes every day. So yeah, I think that's just a useful perspective. Being able to evaluate arguments between people and some of these conflicts and areas, that's almost a fool's game. Because if myself and some other scientific-minded content producer can't agree on something, what makes you think that if you're struggling to understand this content, that you're going to come in there and really be able to discern it? I'm not saying you shouldn't watch it or you shouldn't understand it or you shouldn't, see which is a more logical or more empirically foundationed argument. But if you're really trying to think of it from that athlete's perspective, what do I do to get bigger or better or stronger, in the near future? That's not where your effort should be. It should be on learning those principles, like you said, Berto.
Yeah, it's oh man, not to belittle it, but it's kind of like a fun, like, let's wank off with my boys and let's just like get after each. It's a good time in its own way, It's like I said, it's like this additional hobby, and at the end, it's like, hey, you have all your GEs, right? A little bit of that nuance, but it's like it at its core, it's like so individual. Like I will sit down with someone, have a Skype, they've done all their homework. It's like they don't miss a podcast. They've read the pyramids and can cite them backwards, right? It's fantastic because we're on the same page. But as we go and we're making their program, we're not on the same page because sometimes a rule is broken here or this is kind of twisted in that direction. And it's because this is what fits you, man, and what's going on. So at the end, it's nice to know like kind of what is, I guess, best practice. What do we know, and like again, but at the end you're going to have to make so much adjustments and tweaks because again, like especially the bottom of the pyramid, it's the adherence thing, whether it be it's like okay, it's like bro, you're 45 now, you're not 25 anymore. We're gonna have to, probably bring down our frequency or how much volume we do on a daily basis. It's or someone's weight loss plan might be altered a little bit simply because their environment isn't super conducive to the rate that might be recommended on paper. That is, under most conditions, practically is very sensible and like, let's go, let's do it that way. So, at the end, whether it's on yourself or if you're working on someone else's like metaphorical car, like it's really going to come down to the context of their situation. And I think fortunately and unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, humans, we're not perfect, we're not paper. And that's kind of the fun and the art of it is that, it's like, okay, this is the situation. I can look at it as like, oh man, this is totally fucked. Or it's like, you know what? I'm going to get a little sharper when it comes to knowing when to use this tool, when to use that tool, because everyone's situation's just a little bit different. So yeah, it's especially when I Skype and someone's like, I just know that they're just like a total egghead when it comes to this stuff. I'm like, oh man, they're gonna be so disappointed when we do this and that, and they're wondering why. Just recently, like with the a bit more of a push when it comes to the I guess revamping people's lifestyles when it comes to eating. Like when we go over the structure plan that works best with their situation and like their background and what they're willing to do. Something I hear a lot. It's like, but the bros do that. Like, it's only the bros that like have fruits and vegetables with like every meat. And I'm like, but this is gonna work, man. And you're gonna see as you dive into it why this is probably better for you than just solely focusing on macros and thermodynamics. So yeah, I guess it's that artsy part of coaching that I think sometimes we forget. But I mean, it's always going to be that way. So long as we're working with humans, it's always going to be that way.
Eric, I wrote something down here that I wanted to get your thoughts on. As I was talking about how me as a consumer of content kind of tends to wish things would slow down because stuff is coming out so fast, peaking strategies, diet breaks, getting ready for the platform and peaking for the platform, et cetera. It almost contradicted what you were talking about with the pyramids, and I kind of made this little kind of a connection where I kind of entitled principles, kind of those principles that are in the pyramids, they tend to move very slow, and once we establish them and get those things in place, they're never really going to change. But yet strategies, whatever title you want to use, those tend to move fast. And so that was kind of the thing that popped up into my brain when I was thinking, okay, now if I think about my consuming of content, what can I kind of slack on? Maybe I can slack on the principles and just know them, apply them, don't worry too much about trying to brush up on them and get all up to date on what the most recent thing is. Whereas strategies, yeah, now I'm kind of thinking those things I kind of need to brush up on. What's the best way of expressing your strength for the platform? What's the best way to keep fat loss going while maintaining your physique and things like that. And so that was the little saying that I came up with. Principles move slow, strategies move fast. Would you say that's an accurate statement? And can you expand on that maybe?
I like the way you teed that up for me. Thank you. I think ultimately this comes down to like thinking for a second about how do we know what we know, right? So what is a principle? If we establish that, using the framework of the pyramids, like that probably the rates of weight loss, weight gain, appropriate macronutrient intakes, the roles of the macronutrients, and progressive overload, volume, intensity, and frequency that they haven't shifted since the few speculative articles in the 80s that would give some guidance till now, and they really haven't if you actually look at the stuff that was published. Why is that? Well, essentially, it's all these fast-moving pieces of science that are coming out that we're now more aware of. I mean, they were still there. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it was a smaller field in the 80s and 90s than it is today, but there was stuff being published almost out of every research doing university in exercise science and nutrition on a monthly basis in the world, or we'll just keep it to the English-speaking world, in the last like 3, 4, 5 decades, you know. And if you were aware of it all, like you can be now, it would seem like it was a highway of just constant things just coming out. And I get to see it all now in mass because we do a journal sweep, you know, every month. We have hundreds of journals publishing more than 1,000 articles, and that's not everything. That's stuff that's applicable to strength and physique sport. So yeah, if you were to look at all of it going out there, it is crazy. But all the principle is something where the majority of findings consistently show the same thing and they stick. It's almost like if you had this massive like confetti gun, and like every fifth piece of confetti had some glue on it, and you just shot it at a wall, right? Like 80% of what was on that wall, 80% of the confetti would just be falling on the ground.
Falling on the floor, yeah.
You know, and focusing on that confetti makes it seem like it's a tremendous amount. And what sticks on the wall, eventually that becomes principle, right? And the strategies that are more specific and context dependent, like how do I want to peak a power lifter, you can definitely build a body of literature on that and you can get some ideas, but almost invariably, because they're trying to answer a very specific question, it's going to have to be understood as something that is more context dependent. You know, is this person bench only? Or are they a weightlifter? Or are they a power lifter? Do they have a 2-hour weigh-in? Do they have a 24-hour weigh-in? Do they training 3 days a week or 4 days a week? And it'll look quite different. And what comes from that type of, you know, research is going to be a more refined, more agile use of science, if you will. So I think that is a good way of looking at it. And it's also, you know, focusing on kind of the newer information that's less well established makes more sense for people who are, you know, coaches with a well-established track record and who already understand the principles. So I think from and this is a great example of how the same message I gave to the listener applies differently to like us. So I would advise that, you know, Jeff, Brad, Berto, that you guys focus on some of those kind of nuanced current debates and things that are a little sexier, because you are already making sure your athletes have their macros in check, progressive overload, volume, intensity, frequency, all the other things. And you are very familiar with that. You understand how to operate with it. You know how to apply it. So you don't need to focus on it. So what's left? You're looking for other stones to turn over. And because you're experimenting with things that may or may not have an impact at all, but certainly aren't part of the 90% of what does the work, there's little cost, right? So it gives you the opportunity to have some, you know, experimental progression, if you will, in your coaching methods. You can go, you know what, let me try a different approach to intermittent dieting, or a different approach to progressing volume, or let me try a different tapering strategy, or let me try leaning a little more on intensity and doing singles at a higher RPE. We don't have good data to suggest that any of those are the next best thing. And we know they can't be, because we've already got the vast majority of the pie already cooked. But the pie's cooked. So that's what we're always doing for everybody. So what remains? And it's turning over those stones. So I think that's a really good way of framing it. And I think that's very different than someone who steps into the evidence-based community 6 months ago and is focused on those same things that you guys are without that foundation, because then they can't discern between the importance of, well, our diet breaks physiologically beneficial or psychologically. They're worrying about that when they, like maybe like Berto was, aren't even actually tracking their calories or understanding the importance of energy balance. So yeah, do you feel like that answered your question, Brad?
Yeah, more than enough. And I guess, Berto, just throw it into your court too. You know, do you have anything to kind of add to that as far as principles move slow, strategies and nuance tends to move fast?
Well, I guess the big discussion, you know, what really sparked this was the fact that, you know, someone hears something and is like, oh, I'm going to apply this starting next week. And it's like, no, just hold your horses. So man, it's, again, just it's broken record. It's like, hey, fundamentals first. Like, make sure you have those in order. Make sure they're solid. You want to play with some nuanced stuff, maybe one or two things. It's like, hey, I'm gonna try these 48-hour refeeds this next cutting phase. Like that's fine. But sit on ideas and like really honestly just go down that rabbit hole on like one or two subjects. I think that is especially during my last prep, because I did so much walking outside. I was listening to like a new podcast like every day, like literally keeping up with everything, which is saying a lot because there's stuff coming out all the time. And I am like, wow, I can see how this can be overwhelming to someone who's brand spanking new to this, because it's kind of overwhelming, like for me right now. And it had to get to the point where it's like, all right, bro, slow down. You get one or two topics a week when it comes to fitness that you like, and then the rest of it can just be that book you want to finish off. And then in your own spare time, you can, whatever things you really want to dive into, dive into those. But you have to slow it down when it comes to the nuanced stuff, because another cliche, it's like, yeah, you miss the forest for the trees sometimes. And if I can find myself in a situation like that, then I can see how for, even though it's not our intention to have it that way for people out there, I can see how they can, especially an excited new learner, they'll pick up a few things and they're like, that's it, I'm gonna do Jeff Albert's volume from like this point on. And it's like, no, that's not what we're trying to say either. So, so yeah, pick one or two things at a time and just like really, really exhaust those, I think, before you move on. Because sometimes, shoot, hey, not to call out my boy here, but remember when you made like the perfect program that one time, Eric?
Oh yeah,
it was like pizza with every topping in there, and it's like, yeah, okay, like maybe we could have done with half of this, right?
Fit every recommendation by every study I was aware of at the same time. Yep. Yeah. It was the Wernbaum 2007 program. Just to piggyback on what you're saying, Berto, I think, and to kind of go back to answering your question, Brad, there's a very different way to think about the more faster moving elements of information when you're an athlete versus a coach. So it really behooves you, Brad, and you, Berto, and myself, and Jeff, to be aware of all the various methods and strategies that are out there and that are being discussed, because they're potential tools in our tool belt for situations that we may run into that we can't even predict. I would say you guys are probably getting surprised less often by strange situations or quirks, physiological or psychological or socially, of your clients, but it damn sure still happens, and it's not like any of us predicted we'd be training people in the middle of a global pandemic, more than a year ago. And we've had to adapt new tools to that situation. But so I think there does need to be some kind of this ongoing maintenance work of continuing education, staying up to date as a coach, so that you still have a tool belt that is broad enough to fit your clientele. But I think that's very different than what I see in many of the neurotic athletes out there who stay up to date with everything from a fear of missing out. They feel like if they don't stay up with the latest episode of X, Y, and Z podcast, research review, blog post, or whatever, that they're not going to get the best gains because everyone's talking about insert current conversation in the evidence-based community.
Yeah.
And I think this is somewhat at the heart of what kind of led us here, is that, if there was no problem for you, I'm speaking to an athlete, everything was going well, all of your T's were crossed, all your I's were dotted, and you listened to a podcast, and all of a sudden you felt a sense of urgency and the need to change something, that doesn't really make sense. Not to say that it can't be better and the grass might not be green on the other side, but certainly if everything's working, a podcast doesn't change that reality all of a sudden, and you can think like, actually, I wasn't gaining strength, I was losing it, and my arm wasn't getting bigger, that's all just fat. It's rewriting history by learning that I didn't do this thing on this podcast. That I think you want to avoid. And I think a lot of people are motivated from a sense of fear or missing out, like I said, that little bit of FOMO. And that's what motivates them to stay up on top of this. And if I could turn that on its head and ask anyone who can identify that element in themselves to have a different perspective if I was to frame it differently, coaches need to be aware of these things for the prospective problems that they can't even know that they're going to have. But you as an individual, it probably makes more sense to focus on the fundamentals and then pay attention to strategies and the things that are being discussed as a solution in a more reactionary sense. Like if things are going great, awesome. Why do you need to listen to this new podcast about progressions or breaking plateaus, or how do you adhere to your fat loss diet if it's going great for you and you've had no problem with adherence? However, if you find yourself stuck or mired in one of these problems, that's when it's time to maybe, okay, let me go see what's out there. How are other people solving this problem? But I can't tell you how many times people end up creating problems rather than solving them by looking for solutions that they don't even need because nothing is actually wrong. So very different perspective. The recommendation I would give to some WNBF pro who's decided that he wants to start incorporating, science into his program would be to evaluate what is currently not working, and let's take a look at it and see what we can optimize or make more efficient, rather than let's try to incorporate everything and assume that what we've been doing is all a problem. And the advice I would give to, like I just did to Jeff, Berto, or Brad, would be, you kind of got to keep your hat in the ring. You got to stay aware. You got to have, a couple research reviews, a couple key podcasts. I don't know, maybe have a chief science officer on your team who, has a slightly unkempt beard and needs to satisfy his ego with more degrees than necessary and keeps him on the podcast behind you. Not to be too specific, but somebody like that to keep you up to date. Like, you get my point. Do something so that you can know what's out there. But I don't think that's the same advice I would give to an athlete, because I think that it doesn't make sense. You have one specific situation that, while it changes over time, and we're not static individuals, you only got to solve your problems. And I would encourage you to not get information overload by trying to solve problems that don't even yet exist.
Yeah, you pretty much you put into words what a lot of times I myself will not only apply to myself but my athletes, is that podcasts are a dime a dozen, and sometimes they need to be looked at for really what they truly are, and that's entertainment. I love listening to you and Omar sometimes, not so much because what I'm going to take from it is earth-shattering information that I'm going to be able to apply to myself and my athletes. But I mean, I'll admit it. Sometimes you guys just crack my shit up, and it feels really good to just freaking laugh, But yeah, you put into words, it's kind of like there's so much stuff out there. You really got to kind of look at it more as, okay, there's this new Netflix series called XYZ, There's this new podcast. Let's listen to that for kind of entertainment value, kind of more than anything. And then just kind of think to yourself, oh, wow, that's crazy that they're doing this. And then leave it at that. You know what I mean? And then maybe it's something that you might, a little light bulb might turn on, or a little birdie might whisper in your ear and say, hey, I remember this podcast where they were talking about frequency. I remember frequency was one of the things that I missed for a long time. Because again, my program was working, I was adhering to it. There was progressive overload. There was all the volume was there, but I was doing things once a week, and I kept going back to it, because it was working. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, shit, maybe I should take that 15 sets of chest and break it into 2 days, And so that's kind of the same thing. It was like when I came to that conclusion, it's like, oh, the little birdie just whispered into my ear, or the little light bulb turned on. Maybe I should do things twice a week and start attending to this thing now that Brad's learned called frequency, But really, that's kind of what it boils down to a lot of times with all of the content that's out there. Is I just got to say, look, this is for me more so entertainment, and then separate that from, okay, this is something that I need to learn right now. I need to have a better way that my athletes cut weight for the platform, and start consuming information and trying to really delve into that nuance, I guess you might say, and just kind of critically think and apply those things, and not even apply, but get all my ducks in a row first before I start making my strategies,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's helpful to think about each person on the equation sides, the various equation sides of the content. There's the content creator. They're thinking very differently about what the content they're creating than the content consumers, who we've already given two examples of two very different perspectives, and an athlete or a coach. So to kind of give someone, and we're all content creators, that's why we're on this podcast, to give someone some perspective. An interesting thing that I think about when I make podcasts or when I do blog posts is this needs to have some element of being timeless. I don't want to just contribute to the traffic, and I think most of the time we do a pretty good job of that. And the result of that, and I'm sure there are some people listening, if you've asked me a question on Instagram, 9 out of 10 times, my response is, hey, check out podcast number blank. Check out this article. I want you to Google X, Y, and Z. Or, hey, not to push my books on you, but I think you should get my books. And there's a reason why I think of it that way. And that's because while a lot of this stuff is for entertainment value, and I think it's very interesting, and we like to nerd out about it. From the content creator's perspective, a lot of the time they're thinking about what are all the various things we've seen, and how can we put something out there that solves a specific problem. We're almost playing kind of like the way I think of it. I see like whack-a-mole, like the moles come up, and I want to permanently whack that mole. I want that hole closed. I know another hole is going to happen. It's going to come up, or people need a reminder, or they won't want to watch me on an S3 from 2013 on a video, and I'll have to do something, a new take on it, or update it. But a lot of the times, I'm trying to, even though it's sometimes futile, permanently solve a problem and answer that question for someone. And I am proud to say that there is some work that is, ultimately, while the pyramids have been updated twice, written as books, the content hasn't changed that much. So I am sometimes referring people back to stuff I did almost 10 years ago now. So yeah, I think, anyway, it's just a very different perspective on all sides. So yeah, I don't know if that's super useful to you as a listener, but I think this podcast itself is an example of us seeing something come up and go, oh, like we need to actually work on the critical thinking engine that underlies all of our discussions for our audience, to make that better. So there's almost like a meta kind of discussion that even goes into this podcast. Like, yes, there's a lot of information out there, and it is easy to get overwhelmed by it. And now we're making more information about how to better understand information.
Yeah. But you know what? I think when I go back, like this has kind of made me reflect. I get applications now, and I compare them to what they were 5-10 years ago. And it used to be, it just happens so often where I'd be like, oh, I am about to rock your world because you are doing so many things wrong. But now it's getting harder and harder to see those big flaws, and I think more often than not, what I end up having them perhaps focus on a little bit more is, again, they're, rather than what is perfect, what Eric might have recommended in regards to like weekly volume, like it's more along the lines of like, all right, but like, let's talk about you, man. Let's talk about your situation. Yeah, let's kind of know where that ideal target might be around. But let's look at your own personal situation and start there, because sometimes they're so infatuated with the data, they kind of forget about themselves. So, but still, in regards to the applications and what people are doing now compared to 5-10 years, it's actually really exciting when I think about it. And I think a lot of this discussion, more so than anything, was about just getting more joy out of the learning aspect of things, rather than it being some anxiety-induced experience that has you feeling like you're doing, a bunch of things wrong, because it probably isn't the case if you have your base pretty well set up.
Yeah, that's well said. I think thinking about your base or your priorities or your foundation, all the different words we've used, that is about your setup, and I think that's the way to frame it is really invest the time and energy to understand the nuances and the basics of that knowledge, really become a good student of the sport to set up your home base. And then from there, I think it should be more like that reactive, I'm going to look outward to solve problems. And that way, you're never going to catastrophize over the new information that comes out. You're never going to have that moment of everything I've known is wrong, assuming that you're starting with kind of the type of information we're talking about. And that should give you a sense of security, that nothing will crazy drastically change right now when we're talking about those big rocks. And I think that's good, So yeah, I'm reflecting back to like, what's the purpose of this podcast? It's helping people understand that when they listen to us talk about how to deal with the struggles of being 6 weeks out, that it doesn't apply to you when you're, trying to cut down from, 40% body fat to the 30s, and you've only been lifting weights for 6 months. It's understanding that how I might have tapered, Bryce Lewis for Worlds is not necessarily the approach you're going to take for your first meet. That's interesting. It's cool information, but it's not the thing that you need to be spending your true energy on. And it can be an entertainment value. And don't get me wrong, I love to hear about what top level athletes and top level coaches are doing. But it doesn't necessarily really enter the same part of my brain as the part of my brain that sits down and I go, okay, I'm gonna read a study, or okay, let me write this program. Let me open up Google Sheets and figure out how to solve this problem. So yeah, I think be guarded with what you decide enters into your actual problem solving skills, because ultimately that's what all this is. It's, all right, how do I navigate this maze? How do I ensure that I'm still making progress? How do I integrate my goals with my life? How do I quote unquote hack my goals and my lifestyle and all these things? How do I set up the habits that are going to serve me? And how do I get better at refining that every day? And that is an active process of sitting down and using your noodle, for want of a better word. And that's not something that should be pushed and swayed by content, You should be looking outward when you need a new tool. Like, oh shit, I have a lug nut. I need a different type of wrench. Not, oh wait, I shouldn't have a lug nut. I should have a screw because I listened to this podcast and let me go find out what tool I need. But oh crap, that guy says that I shouldn't even be using lug nuts at all. And I think more often that's what happens. And you find yourself, instead of being the mastermind behind your own plan to move forward, but instead being kind of this messenger who keeps getting caught midway to delivering a message to going, I'm going the wrong way and going somewhere else. And you become this fish in a stream that constantly goes different directions. So yeah, I think the trick here is how do you find agency? How do you become the person who is actually directing your own goals? And I think that really requires you to start viewing content in a different way and differentiating between different types of content, and not necessarily putting, fundamental quote unquote textbook ideas on the same level as that recent debate that happened to be on X podcast. So yeah, that's all I got to say.
That was a nice cherry on top. I don't think that I've got anything to add.
I've been going down
happy to complete our cupcake.
The building your own deck rabbit hole, and I'll remember all this because I have like 3 or 4 dudes fighting over what type of wood it should be, when I should probably take a step back and more so just focus on, I guess, measuring twice, right, as they say. So yeah, I think we did a good job, boys. That was a complicated one, but I think it'll get the job done, maybe.
I hope so. And as always, everybody, we appreciate you listening. We hope that we're not only entertainment, as most podcasts should be viewed as, but also a place that you can refer back to think about, ponder, and stay in the driver's seat, heading towards your own goals, rather than letting the road constantly change in front of you after every podcast you listen to. What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Knuckles, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler, where we cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or an athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, and audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on mass content and earn continuing education credits for most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.
Three.